Picture a situation where the intricate, high-stakes game of global strategy isn't just paused or altered, but where the entire table is violently kicked over, scattering every piece into chaos. That is the exact reality we are waking up to right now. In a maneuver that is destined to be remembered as a watershed moment for the 21st century, the Russian Federation has just carried out the most brazen and hostile confiscation of assets linked to the United States since the absolute height of the Cold War tensions. This goes far beyond a simple breaking news banner or a fleeting headline. This is a geopolitical earthquake, a seismic shift that has sent tremors tearing through the highest levels of government in Washington, triggering emergency protocols at NATO headquarters and inducing immediate blind panic across the world's energy markets. In a synchronized multi-ocean operation that clearly took months of planning, Russian naval units and Coast Guard special forces have forcibly boarded, commandeered, and impounded an entire commercial fleet of oil and liquefied natural gas tankers managed by American interests. If you want to stay ahead of the curve as this historic crisis unfolds, please make sure you subscribe to the channel right now and hit that notification bell so you are the first to know when we release our next update. From the turbulent, dark waves of the Black Sea to the freezing, gray approaches of the Baltic, and stretching all the way to the desolate, icy expanses of the Arctic Circle, the sheer magnitude of this operation is difficult to comprehend. In the span of just 24 chaotic hours, 12 massive supervessels, ships operated by American energy titans and flying the flags of allied nations, were seized and taken into Russian custody. The numbers involved here are astronomical. The vessels themselves hold a combined market value of over $3 billion. But that is merely the steel and machinery. The energy cargo sitting in their massive holds is estimated to be worth nearly $800 million. We need to be very clear. This was not a standard maritime regulation check. This wasn't a routine inspection that got out of hand. This was an overwhelming military deployment involving more than 40 Russian surface warships with fighter jets screaming overhead, providing air cover, and reports of attack submarines prowling the depths to guarantee that no foreign navy dared to intervene. Within mere hours of the first distress calls, the White House was in a frenzy trying to draft emergency responses. NATO ambassadors were locked in crisis war rooms, and the global energy exchanges went into a violent tailspin, with graphs drawing vertical lines upward as traders priced in a total collapse of global supply chains. To the casual observer watching the nightly news summary, this looks like a sudden, reckless explosion of rage, a lash out by Moscow in the heat of the moment. But if we dig beneath that superficial story, we discover something far more calculated, cold, and dangerous. What Russia has executed here is neither random nor impulsive. It represents the icy, logical climax of a long chain of cause and effect. It is the result of a series of escalations, strategic pivots, and quiet preparations that have been accumulating in the background for years, largely unnoticed or underreported by the mainstream Western media apparatus. Moscow isn't just showing off its military muscles. It is broadcasting a fundamental tectonic change in how it intends to fight back against Western economic pressure. They are transitioning from a strategy of passively surviving sanctions to a strategy of active, painful economic warfare. The most terrifying part of this scenario isn't the immediate financial loss or the diplomatic shouting match that is currently deafening the UN. It is the precedent this sets. Russia is effectively declaring that, under specific legal and security justifications that it has written itself, it possesses the right to physically seize the strategic commercial assets of a rival superpower, even when those assets are in contested or international waters. If this logic is allowed to become the new normal, it will not end with Russia and the United States. It cracks open a Pandora's box for similar aggression everywhere, from the volatile waters of the South China Sea to the narrow, dangerous choke points of the Persian Gulf. It threatens to fundamentally rewrite the operating system that governs global trade and maritime security. To truly understand how we walked up to the edge of this cliff, we have to rewind the tape back to the early days of 2022, immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The reaction from the United States and the European Union was not simply to restrict trade. They attempted to surgically excise Russia from the very central nervous system of the global economy. Russian banks were severed from the SWIFT messaging network. Hundreds of billions of dollars in sovereign central bank reserves were frozen with the stroke of a pen. Thousands of companies and individuals were hit with crushing sanctions. But the heavy hammer, the measure with the most profound consequences, dropped at the end of 2022 with the implementation of the oil price cap. This mechanism was designed to be a precision-guided economic weapon. The objective was to stab at the heart of Russian state revenue while keeping just enough oil flowing to prevent a global economic depression. By dictating the maximum price at which Russian crude could be sold and enforcing that rule through Western monopolies on shipping insurance and maritime services, the West hoped to drain Moscow's war chest without completely turning off the global taps. From the policy desks in Washington and Brussels, this was viewed as a sophisticated, calibrated piece of statecraft. From Moscow's perspective, however, this was an act of total economic warfare intended to destroy the foundations of the Russian state, because oil and gas revenues are the absolute lifeblood of their federal budget. Russia could not fight back immediately. To retaliate directly back then would have risked total economic isolation at a moment when they were still scrambling to figure out how to survive the initial shock of the sanctions. Instead, Moscow decided to play the long game. Over the next 2 years, they quietly went to work. They completely reoriented their massive export machine toward Asia. They frantically expanded pipeline infrastructure into China. They beefed up their capacity to ship through the treacherous Arctic routes. And perhaps most critically, they built entirely new financial mechanisms to bypass Western control systems completely. These weren't just economic adjustments. They were strategic preparations for a new reality where Russia would no longer accept Western dominance over the rules of global trade. Throughout this entire period of adjustment, Western energy companies continued to operate their ships near Russian waters, sailing under the comfortable historical assumption that the old norms would keep them safe. Even during the most terrified moments of the Cold War, commercial shipping was generally treated as sacrosanct. The freedom of navigation was a sacred cow, a principle that allowed global business to churn even when superpowers were pointing nuclear missiles at one another. That assumption held firm for decades because everyone understood that breaking it carried risks that were simply too high to contemplate. But by late 2024, that unwritten understanding began to disintegrate. The United States, frustrated that Russia was successfully rerouting its energy exports and blunting the pain of sanctions, quietly decided to turn the screws tighter. American and Allied naval forces began a new campaign of boarding and inspecting tankers that were suspected of carrying Russian oil sold above the price cap. Even in international waters, these boardings were justified under the banners of sanctions enforcement and anti-money laundering laws. To Moscow, however, this looked like a dangerous and unacceptable new precedent. The first domino toppled in November 2024 when a tanker carrying Russian crude destined for Asia was stopped and detained for days while its documentation and cargo were turned inside out. It was eventually released, but the message received in the Kremlin was crystal clear. Washington was willing to use its military assets to enforce its economic will thousands of miles from American shores. Russia protested vehemently through every available diplomatic channel, calling the actions illegal, provocative, and dangerous. Those protests were dismissed. By December, multiple vessels had been boarded, creating a pattern that Russian officials began to describe as systematic harassment. From where Vladimir Putin sat, the United States had crossed a bright red line. They had turned economic sanctions into a form of physical maritime coercion. The logic was simple. If American forces could board and delay Russian-linked shipping whenever they pleased, the next step could be total seizure or permanent detention. The threat was no longer theoretical. It was sitting on their doorstep. And then came the spark, the single incident that transformed simmering tension into a roaring fire of open confrontation. In mid-December, an American-operated tanker collided with a Russian research vessel in the freezing northern waters. The collision was tragic, resulting in the deaths of several Russian crew members. Washington immediately characterized it as an unfortunate accident, blaming poor visibility and navigational errors. Moscow rejected that explanation instantly and completely. They demanded accountability and alleged that this was a deliberate act of misconduct. What followed next would become the legal and political bedrock for the massive seizures we are witnessing today. According to the narrative spun by Russia, this collision was no accident. It was the visible tip of a much darker iceberg. Russian officials claimed that the American-operated tanker involved was not just a commercial ship. They alleged it was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a vessel equipped with advanced electronic and sonar systems capable of tracking submarine movements and mapping coastal defenses. They accused it of functioning as a dual-use intelligence platform. Now, it is true that such practices exist in the gray zone of international espionage and are not unheard of, but Moscow has increasingly signaled that it views these activities as intolerable, especially when they happen near sensitive military zones. Russian military sources claimed that their research vessel had picked up unusual electronic signatures and had moved in to visually confirm the tanker's identity. In their version of the story, the American tanker panicked and altered course abruptly to evade inspection, causing the crash that killed the Russian sailors. Whether this account is the absolute truth or a carefully constructed cover story is almost beside the point. What matters is that this story became the official, unshakable position of the Russian state. It was repeated on a loop across diplomatic cables, legal filings, and state media. Moscow demanded the tanker return to Russian waters for a full criminal investigation, framing the incident as gross negligence resulting in death rather than a simple maritime accident. The United States refused, citing international maritime law, which grants jurisdiction to the flag state of the vessel. When the tanker continued on its journey, ignoring the demand, Russian authorities declared it a suspect vessel and announced that the crew were wanted fugitives for questioning. This legal framing was incredibly deliberate. By treating the issue as a criminal matter rather than a military dispute, Russia created a pathway for enforcement actions that they could present to the world as lawful police work rather than acts of war. Behind the closed doors of the Kremlin, planners were already mapping out a much broader response. The collision wasn't the sole cause, but it provided the perfect catalyst, a narrative anchor. For months, Russian security institutions had been arguing about how to respond to what they saw as American arrogance and maritime enforcement. The consensus they reached was grim. Continued restraint was only encouraging the West to push harder. If Russia wanted to stop future boardings, they had to impose real, tangible costs. That decision turned into action in early January. We are going to break down the strategic genius and danger of this move in just a moment. But first, if you are finding this analysis helpful, please hit that like button and share this video. It helps us navigate the algorithm and bring you more content like this. Russian naval and Coast Guard units launched their simultaneous operations across multiple maritime theaters. In the Black Sea, tankers carrying crude oil from Central Asia were intercepted, surrounded, and escorted into Russian ports. In the northern waters, vessels trying to transit the Arctic routes were boarded under the pretext of environmental inspections and security checks. In the approaches to the Baltic Sea, additional ships were detained near critical choke points that are vital for European trade. The operation was synchronized, it was overwhelming, and it was clearly pre-planned to the minute. The official statement from Russia was a masterpiece of careful wording. Authorities cited obscure international maritime provisions that allow coastal states to act against vessels that threaten national security, violate environmental regulations, or engage in unauthorized surveillance. The tanker involved in the December collision was explicitly named as Exhibit A, proof that commercial shipping was being used as a cover for hostile activities. The crews of these seized ships were described not as hostages, but as material witnesses in ongoing criminal investigations. The language was legalistic by design, aimed at creating a fog of ambiguity to delay immediate military retaliation from the West. Strategically, these seizures served multiple overlapping purposes. First and foremost, they demonstrated that Russia would no longer be a punching bag for economic pressure. For 2 long years, Moscow had endured sanctions and adjusted its economy on the fly. But endurance without retaliation risks looking like weakness. By seizing American-operated energy assets, Russia proved it could inflict visible, painful costs on the U.S. without firing a single missile or crossing the border into open warfare. Second, this action targeted the specific infrastructure that underpins Western dominance of the global energy trade. Even when Russian oil flows to Asia, Western companies often control the tankers, the insurance policies, and the financing deals. By exposing just how vulnerable that infrastructure is to state action, Moscow is practically forcing the market to shift away from Western-controlled logistics. Asian buyers now have a massive financial incentive to rely on Russian or non-Western shipping fleets, which accelerates the fragmentation of the global energy market. Third, the move carried immense domestic political value. With elections on the horizon, the Kremlin benefits hugely from appearing decisive and strong in the face of Western aggression. State media has framed these seizures as a righteous, justified response to American bullying, reinforcing the narratives of sovereignty and resistance. For the Russian elite and the public, this operation reinforced the image of a leadership that is willing to defend national interests with iron resolve. There is also a fascinating international dimension that has flown under the radar. Russia did not act in isolation or in ignorance of how the world would react. Diplomatic signals strongly suggest that Moscow communicated its intentions to key partners before the raid. While no one gave an explicit public endorsement, the silence from major non-Western powers is deafening. In this context, silence functions as a form of tacit acceptance. For countries that are heavily dependent on Russian energy, the situation creates a nightmare of uncomfortable trade-offs. Condemning Russia risks their energy security. Supporting the West risks alienating a supplier that has just proven it is willing to act with extreme force. Many nations have chosen the path of ambiguity, calling for dialogue while avoiding taking a side. This significantly weakens the narrative that Russia stands alone against a unified world. The most profound consequence of these events lies in the legal precedent they are threatening to cement. By asserting a right to seize vessels based on broad security, environmental, or criminal claims, Russia is challenging the long-standing assumptions about freedom of navigation. If these arguments gain even a foothold of legitimacy, the implications for global shipping are catastrophic. Nearly every modern commercial vessel carries electronic equipment that a hostile state could label as surveillance gear. Environmental rules are broad, vague, and easily politicized. The line between lawful enforcement and economic hostage-taking becomes dangerously thin. What we are watching unfold is not chaos for the sake of chaos. It is a calculated challenge to a maritime order that Russia believes no longer serves its interests. Moscow is signaling that rules written and enforced primarily by Western powers are not written in stone. They can be contested, they can be reinterpreted, and if necessary, they can be broken to force a renegotiation. This marks a decisive shift from passive resistance to active rebalancing, a shift that will shape not just this crisis, but the future of global trade and security. To understand why this escalation follows a grim internal logic, we have to strip away the moral language and look at the situation through a realist lens. In the brutal world of international politics, there is no global police force capable of enforcing rules equally on everyone. Power, not principle, is what ultimately determines the outcome. When a state believes its core interests are under threat and peaceful avenues offer no relief, it seeks other ways to restore the balance. From Moscow's perspective, that is exactly what has happened. For 2 years, Russia watched the boundaries of acceptable economic coercion expand. Sanctions hardened into long-term structural cages. Financial assets were stolen, energy revenues were capped. Then came the direct maritime enforcement, boardings in international waters justified by unilateral rules that much of the world never voted for. Each step narrowed Russia's room to maneuver. When they protested, they were ignored. The message Moscow received was that restraint would only invite more pressure. Russia lacks the economic leverage to respond symmetrically. They cannot freeze Western central bank assets or dominate the global financial system. But what they do possess is regional military power, especially in the maritime zones close to their own territory. Using that power to impose costs on Western commercial interests is not irrational behavior from a realist standpoint. It is a classic balancing move designed to force the adversary to stop and ask, is continued pressure worth this risk? This is exactly why the seizures were executed under a legal framing rather than with open brute force. Russia is not seeking a shooting war with NATO. It is seeking to alter the cost-benefit calculation in Washington and allied capitals. By detaining vessels under contested but plausible legal claims, Moscow raises the price of enforcement without triggering an automatic military response. The gamble is that Western governments will hesitate to escalate to war over commercial assets and civilian crews, especially when the legal waters have been deliberately muddied. The immediate impact of this strategy is already hitting home. Energy markets reacted with sharp volatility. Insurance rates for shipping near Russian waters have surged sky high. Some routes became effectively uninsurable overnight. These costs ripple outward like a tsunami, affecting producers, consumers, and governments thousands of miles away from the confrontation. That diffusion of pain is precisely the point. It transforms a bilateral dispute into a systemic problem that pressures third parties to beg for de-escalation. For Europe, the shock is particularly acute. Many European firms still rely on complex supply chains that touch Russian-controlled or Russian-adjacent routes. The seizure of cargo purchased through intermediaries exposes just how fragile these arrangements are. Losses may not be fully covered by insurance. leaving companies to absorb multi-million-dollar hits. Over time, this encourages them to simply disengage or accept Russian terms for operating in these regions. Either outcome is a win for Moscow's strategic interests. The human dimension here is equally significant and tragic. Hundreds of crew members now find themselves caught in a geopolitical standoff they had absolutely no role in creating. Regardless of the legal terminology used, their freedom now depends on negotiations between governments locked in a bitter confrontation. History suggests such negotiations can drag on for months or years, with human lives reduced to bargaining chips. This reality underscores how economic warfare inevitably spills over into personal tragedy. Beyond the immediate crisis lies a more troubling transformation of maritime security. If commercial shipping becomes a routine target of state pressure, navies will be drawn ever deeper into the job of protecting trade. Escorts, patrols, and shows of force will become standard in contested waters. This militarization raises costs and drastically increases the risk of miscalculation. A collision or a misinterpreted maneuver between naval vessels could escalate far more quickly than any policymaker intends. Over time, global shipping is likely to fragment along geopolitical lines. Western companies will avoid routes near adversarial powers. Russian and Chinese firms will dominate those corridors, but face restrictions elsewhere. The efficiency of global trade will suffer as routes get longer, costs rise, and redundancy replaces optimization. What was once a seamless global system begins to resemble a patchwork of guarded corridors and contested zones. Legally, the world may be entering an era of competing maritime frameworks. States aligned with Russia and China will push interpretations that limit sanctions enforcement and expand the authority of coastal states. Western powers will desperately defend existing norms of freedom of navigation. Without consensus, disputes will proliferate, resolved not by shared rules, but by who has the biggest gun and the highest tolerance for risk. For smaller states and companies, navigating this landscape becomes increasingly perilous. From this perspective, these seizures are less about anger or revenge and more about signaling. Russia is declaring that the post-Cold War assumption of uncontested Western maritime dominance is over. The rules that allowed sanctions to be enforced without reciprocal vulnerability are being challenged head-on. Whether this leads to negotiation or entrenched confrontation depends entirely on how other powers respond. If Western policymakers double down on enforcement without adjustment, they invite further retaliation and the normalization of seizures. If they seek de-escalation, they may need to accept limits on how far economic warfare can extend into physical space. Neither path is easy. Both require acknowledging that the era of cost-free coercion is ending. What is clear is that this episode marks a turning point. Commercial shipping, once insulated from great power rivalry, is now firmly in the crosshairs. The assumption that trade flows safely because everyone benefits no longer holds water. Power is reasserting itself as the ultimate guarantor of access, and states are preparing to defend or deny that access with increasing boldness. Before we move to the final implications, let me know in the comments, do you think this leads to a new Cold War at sea, or will cooler heads prevail? I read every comment. Looking ahead, the consequences of this moment will not be confined to the fate of the seized vessels or the immediate diplomatic crisis. What Russia has done reshapes expectations about how far economic confrontation can go before it spills into physical control of assets. For decades, sanctions were assumed to operate in a largely abstract financial realm. Ships sailed, goods moved, and enforcement happened through banks, insurers, and piles of paperwork. That separation has now collapsed. Economic pressure has become tangible, physical, and enforceable at sea. For the United States, this presents an uncomfortable reality. The financial losses involved here are manageable, but the strategic signal is devastating. American commercial power has long rested on the assumption that U.S. naval dominance ensures freedom of navigation for allied trade anywhere on Earth. When vessels can be seized near a rival sphere of influence without immediate consequence, that assumption weakens. Adversaries elsewhere are watching closely. If Russia can do this in the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Arctic, others will ask why similar tactics cannot be applied in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, or the South China Sea. Energy markets will continue to feel the aftershocks. Even if the seized cargoes are eventually released, the perception of risk lingers like a bad smell. Traders price fear much faster than they price reassurance. Higher transport costs, longer routes, and increased insurance premiums inevitably flow through to consumers. For Europe, still struggling with competitiveness and energy security, this compounds existing pressures. For developing economies, it raises the cost of fuel and food, deepening global inequality. All of this stems from a single escalation that turned abstract sanctions into concrete seizures. The maritime insurance industry, often invisible to the public, may become one of the most powerful actors shaping the outcome. Insurers determine which routes are viable. If they judge certain waters uninsurable, trade simply stops, regardless of what politicians declare. Russia understands this leverage perfectly. By introducing uncertainty, it forces insurers to reassess risk models that were built on assumptions of restraint that no longer apply. Once those models change, reversing them is slow and difficult. Strategically, Russia has also imposed a new defensive burden on the West. Protecting commercial shipping in contested waters requires escorts, surveillance, and constant readiness to respond. That ties down naval assets that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. It also increases the likelihood of close encounters between rival forces, where accidents or misjudgments can escalate rapidly. Deterrence at sea is inherently fragile, dependent on professionalism and restraint under extreme stress. At the same time, Moscow has accepted costs of its own by challenging established norms. Russia invites reciprocal actions in areas where it is vulnerable. Russian shipping and assets abroad may face greater scrutiny or seizure. Long-term trust in Russia as a predictable trading partner erodes even further. Yet from the Kremlin's perspective, these costs are outweighed by the strategic necessity of breaking what it sees as an intolerable imbalance. A system where one side can enforce rules globally, while the other absorbs punishment without response is, in realist terms, unsustainable. The deeper implication is that the international system is sliding toward a more openly transactional and coercive order. Legal arguments matter, but they matter most when backed by hard power. States will increasingly test boundaries, probing how far they can go without provoking catastrophic retaliation. Commercial actors will be forced to adapt, factoring geopolitics into decisions once driven purely by efficiency and profit. For policymakers, the lesson is stark. Economic warfare does not remain contained in a box. When sanctions are enforced with military tools, they invite military responses. Escalation does not always look like missiles or troops crossing borders. Sometimes it looks like boarding ladders, legal notices, and seized cargoes. These actions can be just as destabilizing precisely because they sit in gray zones where response options are limited and ambiguous. Whether this crisis becomes a one-off shock or the beginning of a sustained pattern depends on choices made in the coming months. Negotiation could establish clearer boundaries and restore some predictability. Continued escalation could normalize the seizure of commercial assets as a routine instrument of statecraft. The latter path leads to a world where trade flows not according to market logic, but according to power and proximity to armed force. What is beyond doubt is that a line has been crossed. The post-Cold War maritime order, built on assumptions of uncontested freedom of navigation under Western protection, has been openly challenged. Russia has demonstrated that it is willing to use force, law, and ambiguity together to defend its interests and impose costs on adversaries. Other powers are taking note. We are entering an era where ships are no longer just carriers of goods, but instruments and targets of geopolitical pressure. In that world, safety is not guaranteed by rules alone, but by the ability to enforce them. The seizure of these vessels is not the end of a story. It is the opening chapter of a more dangerous phase in global competition, where economic rivalry and military power are inseparable and where every major trade route becomes a potential front line.